In just one dry season, a forest the size of a city can vanish. Fire inches forward through the trees. Black ash settles under a pink sky. And by morning, grass appears. Short, tough, ready for cattle. From an office in Bogota, this looks like a crime scene. But for the family living here, it's something else entirely. It's a pension plan, a property line, a gamble against an uncertain future. We're often told a simple story. Bad actors burning the Amazon while the state rushes in to save it. But what if that story misses the real force holding everything together? Not a cartel, not a government order, but a market, informal, disciplined, and enforced by violence, where land, money, and risk are tightly linked. This is Vista Hermosa, a Colombian municipality at the heart of the country's so-called arc of deforestation. And its story shows how land, labor, and war push small farmers to clear forest. Not because they hate trees, but because trees don't pay mortgages. We're going to take this step by step. First, how history shaped the frontier. Then, how a system came along and put a price on trees. After that, what life actually looks like for the people living inside that system. And finally, why? Despite truces, programs, and big promises, the pressure to clear land just keeps coming back. This frontier didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was created. In the middle of the 20th century, conflict was pushing peasants out of the Andean coffee regions. People were being displaced, and the state needed somewhere to send them. So it turned to the Amazon Piedmont and used it as a kind of pressure valve. Roads were cut through the forest. Colonization projects were launched. Credit was offered. The goal was simple: turn jungle into pasture. At the time, international lenders, development agencies, and national governments all believed the same thing: that grass and cattle were symbols of progress, the fast track to modernization. So occupation became official policy. Land was divided up, roads kept expanding, and livestock financing sealed the deal. And that's how the frontier was built, by design, not by chance. By the 1970s, something interesting and troubling started to happen. Money meant for roads and cattle projects, along with research into tropical pastures, quietly turned conservation maps into development plans. Take the Macarena Special Management Area. On paper, it was created to be protected. But on the ground, roads were cut through it, settlements popped up, and life moved in. At the same time, insurgent groups were strengthening their control in the area. So this one landscape ended up carrying two very different stories at once. Officially, it was a sanctuary. In reality, it was a lived-in homeland, shaped by people, politics, and survival. In a place called Vista Hermosa, life in the forest was shaped by the presence of guerrilla groups, in complicated ways. On one hand, they controlled violence, taxed coca, and even built roads. But here's the surprising part. They also limited how much forest people could clear, mostly for tactical reasons. And that created a strange paradox. Coca could grow quietly under the forest canopy, but cattle ranching? That had to wait. Open pastures were basically off limits. Fast forward a few decades. When demobilization and crop substitution programs finally arrived, that tight knot began to loosen. And once it did, the landscape started to change. Fast. The consequences? They weren't what anyone fully expected. For a peasant family, the forest isn't some abstract idea. It's very real. It can be an asset or a problem, depending on whether it makes your farm more valuable or less. In a place like Vista Hermosa, land is constantly being bought and sold, even if it's not official. Everyone understands how it works. Community leaders witness land sales, people write simple sale agreements, and local lenders actually accept those papers as collateral. Buyers and sellers know the price of land by heart. How much a hectare costs in this area versus that one. It's an informal market, but it's organized, active, and widely trusted. What's really interesting is the role of the state. The Ministry of Agriculture lends money using these informal land papers, which quietly makes the deals feel legitimate. But at the same time, the environmental authority looks at the same land and says, "No, this is protected forest." So you end up with a strange contradiction. One arm of the government treats the land like a market, and the other treats it like a national park. When we talked to farmers and looked at market prices, one thing became really clear. The more pasture a farm has, the more it's worth when you try to sell it. Even a small increase in cleared land can push the price up enough to change how a family thinks about their land. Cutting trees starts to feel like a smart financial move. Because here's the hard truth. You can't take a standing forest to the bank. But grass, cows, those count as money. Now watch what happens when conservation payments ignore opportunity cost. A lot of these programs, like 𝗂𝗵𝗹, Incentivo Forestal Amazónico, or even flat carbon prices, pay everyone the same amount per hectare or per ton of carbon. Sounds fair, right? But here's the problem. They don't care whether that land could make way more money as cattle pasture. So in places where clearing forest brings in big profits, those conservation payments just can't compete. And that's why the cattle economy wins. Long before anyone starts pointing fingers and calling ranchers criminals. When the state tries to erase the real market, the one ordinary farmers and peasants actually depend on, it doesn't stop deforestation. It just pushes it into the shadows. Trees are still cut, but now it's labeled illegal. People get criminalized, soldiers get sent in, and no one replaces the income that was taken away. The demand is still there. The money signal is still flashing, and the chainsaws, they're still answering the call. Here's where things take a turn. When guerrillas were in control, coca was king, but it came with its challenges. It needed a lot of labor, and land was tight. The forest wasn't just there. It actually helped hide the crops, which meant farmers couldn't clear too much land. Wages were high, and finding workers was tough. Then peace deals happened, and crop substitution programs were introduced. Coca started to shrink, restrictions on clearing land loosened, and suddenly unemployment went up. Wages dropped. Labor became cheaper at the exact same time that more land became available. But instead of farmers diversifying their crops, most of them went in one direction: large-scale cattle ranching. Let's break down why this shift happened so fast. There are two big reasons. First, soil legacy. Coca leaves behind chemical residues that make growing crops tricky, expensive, and unpredictable. Pasture, on the other hand, can handle degraded soil. So, the quickest way to reuse the land? Plant grass, and then bring in the cows. Second, logistics. Cattle are just easier to deal with in remote areas. Unlike perishable crops that need cold storage, good roads, and reliable credit, cows basically take care of themselves. In frontier terms, you can think of cattle as a liquid asset with legs. They store value, and you can move them when you need to. You know, households don't just wake up one day and decide to cut down forests for no reason. They're reacting to real pressures, things like sudden job losses, insecurity, or changes in access to credit. When programs meant to support farmers fall apart, like when cocoa wages disappear without any replacement, or when credit is offered for livestock but forests are barely valued, people make the choices that make sense for survival. As one farmer put it, plain and simple, "We have land, we have strength. We can't wait for help that never arrives." And that's the reality driving deforestation on the ground. When we look at the big picture, the national data tells the same story as what's happening on the ground. In areas where land was substituted for other uses, we actually saw more deforestation and cattle taking over, especially where programs didn't really fit the local ecology. And in 𝗿𝗏 Hermosa, the numbers you see at the national level aren't just statistics. They match the real stories people are experiencing there. Imagine the frontier as a living, moving constitution, where who's in charge isn't fixed. Sometimes it's the government, sometimes guerrillas, sometimes local dissidents. And wherever authority goes, the rules of the forest follow. Let me break it down for you in 4 clear phases. First, the war years, roughly 2002 to 2015. Here, guerrillas were in control. They actually enforced limits on deforestation. Why? Partly to protect themselves tactically, partly to keep some order on the land. During this time, land prices were low, cattle herds were limited, and forest loss was relatively contained. Then came the post-accord vacuum, around 2016 to 2018. Restrictions lifted, credit became easy to get, land values shot up, and suddenly everyone wanted a piece of the frontier. Pastures expanded fast, and deforestation spiked. Next, the dissident return, between 2019 and 2021. Dissidents were back, trying to gain legitimacy and revenue. They started allowing and even encouraging clearing, including in new frontier areas. What had been mostly consolidated farms now began to spread out to the edges, and the forest paid the price. Finally, negotiation and moratorium, roughly 2022 to 2023. In talks with the government, dissidents imposed a ban on clearing and burning, even on pastures. Deforestation plummeted, from around 5,000 hectares down to just under 1,500 in a single year. But when negotiations broke down, the ban relaxed to 15 hectares per family, and clearing started up again. So you see, the story of the forest isn't just about trees. It's about power, politics, and who gets to make the rules. Think of the forest not just as trees, but as a kind of signal. In some places, armed groups can actually use deforestation like a dial. They can turn it up or down to show who's in charge, or even to negotiate deals. It's not really about whether what they're doing is legal. It's about who has the power to make and enforce the rules on land. And the consequences hit people hard. When restrictions tighten, forests on private land can suddenly lose their value. Land prices drop, families struggle to put food on the table, and suddenly even small conservation payments start to look like a lifeline, because the alternative is nothing at all. Here's the thing. Simple binaries like legal versus illegal or conservation versus crime just don't work on the frontier. Families and communities are navigating a whole mix of authorities at once. The same government that gives out loans for cattle might completely ignore what's actually happening in the land market. And the same rebel groups who once blocked land clearing can turn around and sell conservation as a way to show they're in charge, until they change their minds. In the end, the forest ends up paying the price, sometimes twice, for people's claims to legitimacy. Let's break down why this system is so unstable. There are 3 feedback loops at play. First, the land price loop. When you clear pasture, the value of your farm goes up, and higher land values make it tempting to clear even more. Conservation payments, if they're fixed, just can't compete. So unless we actually account for the opportunity cost of keeping the forest, this loop just keeps running hot. Second, the labor substitution loop. When coca production ends, suddenly there's extra labor. Combine that with newly available land, and ranching spikes. But ranching doesn't need as many workers, so those extra people go looking for new land to clear, and the cycle starts all over again. Finally, the war governance loop. Every time armed control shifts, the rules of the forest get rewritten. Moratoriums and relaxed regulations turn deforestation into a bargaining chip. The result? Households and conservation programs are left guessing, and stability goes out the window. The humanitarian edge is sharp. Imagine this. Families who've lived on the same land for decades suddenly get branded as criminals, with no clear way to secure legal titles. Conservation officials show up not as partners, but as a threat of eviction. Programs that are supposed to protect our forests, they often underpay exactly where the cost of protection is highest. Meanwhile, cattle loans always seem to arrive on time. If we want to slow down deforestation and actually deliver justice for rural farmers, 𝗿𝗲 Hermosa's research points to 4 big ideas we should keep in mind. First, price the real choice. Any conservation incentive, like paying people to keep forests standing, has to reflect the actual value farmers would get from cutting the forest and turning it into pasture. A flat rate doesn't work when ranching is really profitable in some areas. You need to match the offer to what's actually at stake, zone by zone. Second, recognize the market you already have. A lot of land is traded informally. Families use it to get credit, pass it on through inheritance, or manage their farms. Just pretending those markets don't exist doesn't make them go away. It just forces people into illegal or risky deals and makes programs lose credibility. Third, align substitution with labor. When crops like coca are phased out, you suddenly have a lot of labor without work. Programs need to give those people forest-friendly alternatives. Things like silvopastoral systems, tree crops that can actually be sold, or paid restoration work. And it's not just about planting trees. You need the roads, storage, and credit systems to make these alternatives really viable. Finally, de-weaponize the forest. Conservation can't depend on who controls the checkpoint or the local power structure. Enforcement needs to go hand in hand with real, reliable ways for households to earn a living. Otherwise, people are stuck choosing between hunger and breaking the law. Just putting a moratorium in place without income is not peace. It's just hitting pause. Here in 𝗿𝗲 Hermosa, deforestation isn't some mysterious act by bad guys in a distant land. It's really about the system, the way money, programs, and power all interact. Think about it. When land becomes more valuable as pasture, when labor is cheap, when loans are easier for cows than for trees, and when conflict sets the rules, the forest doesn't stand a chance. It's not that people don't care. It's that the system basically pays them not to. But here's the hopeful part. Change the system, and suddenly, the forest can be the valuable asset it already is. Until that happens, though, the frontier will keep moving. 1 hectare, 1 deal, 1 season at a time. Here are 5 key takeaways about deforestation in the Amazon. 1. It's not just crime, it's economics. People aren't clearing forests because they're bad. For many small farmers, turning forest into pasture actually increases the value of their land. Forests don't pay the bills, pastures do. If we ignore this basic economic reality, conservation incentives are doomed to fail. 2. Informal land markets matter, whether authorities like it or not. Even without official land titles, communities in places like 𝗿𝗏𝗪𝗎 run their own recognized land markets. Banks and credit institutions rely on them, but environmental authorities often ignore them. This creates a kind of rule of 2 worlds, where governance is contradictory. 3. Coca substitution can backfire. When coca cultivation drops, suddenly there's more labor available and fewer restrictions on clearing land. That opens the door for cattle ranching, which needs less labor but a lot more land. So, instead of saving forests, substitution can actually accelerate deforestation. 4. Armed groups act like environmental regulators. It sounds strange, but in areas affected by conflict, guerrilla or dissident groups often impose or lift deforestation bans. Forest loss can become a way to show control, negotiate with the state, or even exert power over communities. 5. Conservation fails if it ignores local livelihoods. Flat-rate payments, stalled land titling, and military-led enforcement often leave communities underpaid, stigmatized, and vulnerable. When people can't survive otherwise, returning to forest clearing becomes a survival strategy. You know, when we talk about deforestation in the Amazon, it's often framed like a battle between good and evil. Environmental defenders on one side, shadowy criminals on the other. But if you look closer, especially in places like 𝗿𝗏𝗪𝗎, it's way more human than that. Here, clearing a hectare of forest isn't just crime. It's a decision about food, safety, inheritance, and survival. It's what happens when policies promise protection, but markets reward destruction. When peace agreements suddenly shift where people work. When the forest itself becomes a bargaining chip in a war that's lasted decades. If we want to change this, it's going to take more than bans or boots on the ground. We need to start seeing the forest as the valuable asset it really is. That means working with the land markets that local people already trust. It means matching environmental goals with real sustainable livelihoods. And it means making sure that when peace finally arrives, the forest isn't left to fend for itself. Because in 𝗿𝗏𝗪𝗎, every pasture, every fence line, every burned clearing tells the same story. People respond to the incentives they're given. If we want a different Amazon, the world has to offer a different deal.
To support us in bringing you more of the political economy of agrarian production, please subscribe to this channel